Good afternoon, it's Monday the 25th of January 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Weather, overcast in Plymouth. What else have we got? Dartmoor. We have a new report from Dartmoor. Not surprising, it's wild and windy. We've got Essex a bit unsettled, and the remainder of the country looks a bit overcast with some rain. But apparently they are smiling in Holland as a result of sunshine and chicken soup. But we're not too sure what that means. Secret message, no doubt, from those overseas. Well, we thought we'd start off today with just some comments, really, that viewers and listeners have sent in. So this one was quite interesting. A big thank you to George, who's been retransmitting UK Column broadcasts. But first of all, somebody said, God bless the UK Column News team and George for putting them on YouTube. So thank you very much, George. We've got this one, which we really like. Again, thank you for bringing logic to the completely senseless place the UK has become. That one must be a very telling comment, Mike, because surely that's what we are trying to do. And then George gets another thank you for sharing the information. So positive comments and good to see, I think. Well, we can move on to this one. Now, this is a little bit different, but this is the sort of information that comes into the column, and it's all very, very useful stuff. Brian, first off, I greatly appreciate the sane soberness of the daily broadcast for your information. I have a good friend who's been a police constable for around 15 years in the West Midlands. His integrity is impeccable. He assures me that trying to get a child into care in his West Midlands borough is very difficult. He says the council does not want the, quote, financial burden of caring for the children. That's good news. Well, it is in a way. The sexualisation of children and the prevent duty is nothing less than psychological child abuse. I'm praying for the removal of Nicky Morgan. I assume that's the local MP, Mike. I haven't checked that. Thanks again for your informative and fearless broadcasts. If I'm missing something, let me know. So we'd like to say, please keep the information coming into us. Sometimes you pick up information which is very local. You see it, it's not reported nationally. But when we see it, it's part of a jigsaw. So do keep those reports coming in.
Right. EU Referendum PsyOps. That's what we're calling it. So Enda Kenny is meeting David Cameron today. Well, he's meeting him in London. And of course, this is all about Brexit and discussions about the new relationship between Britain and the European Union ahead of a summit next month in Brussels, from which Cameron is expecting to bring back a deal which he can present to people and hold a referendum later in the year. But it was really this tweet from Chatham House which piqued my interest, because meeting between Enda Kenny and David Cameron, a pitch for UK-based Irish voters to vote yes in the EU referendum. Well, I thought that was quite an interesting statement from Chatham House, and in fact I did ask the Electoral Commission for confirmation about what the rules are with regard to voting in the referendum, and they say that the franchise for the referendum, this is their language, the franchise for the referendum is based upon the franchise for the parliamentary elections. And what that means is that Commonwealth and Irish citizens that are resident in the UK will be eligible to vote in the referendum. So there was some suspicion of that in my mind for a couple of months. So back in October, I think it was, I sent an email off to the Irish authorities to ask what the voting situation was in Ireland in referenda, and they replied to me with this, saying, I refer to your query in relation to the eligibility to vote at referendums in Ireland. In order to vote in Ireland, a person must be entered in the register of electors for a constituency in the state in which they ordinarily reside, and their citizenship then determines the polls at which they're entitled to vote as follows. British citizens may vote at Dáil, European Parliament and local elections. EU citizens may vote at European Parliament and local elections. Non-EU citizens may vote at local elections only. And Irish citizens alone are entitled to vote at presidential elections and referendums, as well as other elections. Only Irish citizens were eligible to vote in both referendums in the Lisbon Treaty held in June 2008 and October 2009. So I would suggest that if what Chatham House is saying is really what's going on here, and Cameron is attempting to drum up support from the Irish government to encourage Irish voters in Britain to vote for Britain to stay inside the European Union, then this is indeed another arm of the EU referendum PsyOp.
It's just incredible, Mike, isn't it, that this is absolutely in our faces. Okay, some of it you have to know where to look, but then it shines through that we've got David Cameron deceiving the British public again, because he's saying one thing publicly and then behind closed doors he's actually working to make sure the British vote is skewed in his favour, which of course is to lock us into the European Union. And I believe there was a meeting took place on Saturday, was it? Kettering?
That's right. This is the Grassroots Out organisation, which is claiming to be a grassroots get out of the EU organisation. Nigel Farrarge was speaking at it, a bunch of other people speaking at it. But what I think was a little concerning, perhaps I understand why they've done it, but one of the first comments made by the chairperson was that this upcoming referendum is a once-only deal. It's really our last chance, our only chance. Now, whether she was saying that simply to sort of encourage people to get involved and take it seriously, or whether this is what they really believe, I think remains to be seen. But I have to say I'm slightly sceptical of many of these, because we now have, 3 or 4 different get out of the EU groups with regard to this referendum. So the no vote is going to be split.
And there's confusion. People don't know who's saying what. Well, we had a little bit of information in about that meeting. Nigel Farrarge was there. He didn't seem to want to hear about what was really happening in the country. It was all the superficial stuff to do with the referendums coming up and Europe. Got to say, once again, Nigel Farrarge doesn't seem to want to talk the detail of what's happening in Britain, the treason, the fraud, the corruption, the job losses, what's happening with the children. It's all gently pushed away. And apparently he had Royal Marines or former Royal Marines as minders at this meeting. So it seems that for some reason or other, Nigel Farrarge seems to think that he needs albeit very professional bodyguards around him. And the other thing we were told, allegedly, Roger Helmer, MEP, certainly didn't want to talk about any of the detail about what's really happening in UK. And a member of the public said when he tried to tackle Roger Helmer on some of these subjects, he more or less ran away. So that seems to be what he did when we first started to talk about common purpose, Mike. I wonder if that's a clue. Okay, well, let's come back on the subject of information from our viewers. This came through over the weekend. And while this may not seem important to many people, we think it's very important because the British government, whether it's been Tony Blair or Gordon Brown or David Cameron, have been literally selling the family silver by getting rid of public infrastructure, and in particular they've been hammering the military infrastructure. Now, Linda here sent a document talking about the selling off of Ministry of Defence stuff. The bottom 2 lines of the UK column response. We've been aware of this for many years, and many of these sell-offs are concerned with highly dodgy deals. Local developers seem to be able to get their snouts in the trough pretty early, and then along come the housing. But we just wanted to show you the scale of things going on here. So we've got some documents, there are more to come. This is a list of MOD sites. A lot of it is former MOD housing, and now it's going to be turned over to mixed development, leisure, agriculture, all sorts of things. We ask where the money for this sale is going. but there are pages of it. It goes on and on and on. And of course, Mike, you've been asking questions about the sell-off of public assets, and surprise, surprise, the government doesn't seem to want to answer that.
Well, it was worse than that, because the Treasury basically denied having any knowledge of the scale of this. So they basically said, well, we don't have any kind of centralized database, any kind of way of actually measuring how much infrastructure is being sold off. So I thought that was pretty incredible.
So we've got a situation where everything is data-based, and we've just shown lists which must have come from a database list. But when you actually question the government about how much public-owned infrastructure is being sold off, all of a sudden they don't know. I would say they're lying. Well, other serious things coming in, and again, thank you to a viewer for this one, which we thought was just incredible. The implications are so serious. Man ordered to tell police if he plans to have sex. Now, when you get into this article, somebody who was found not guilty has now been put under a sexual harm prevention order, which we'd never heard of before. So you're found not guilty, but now magistrates can put you under this particular order where you have to not only report effectively your movements to the police, you've got to tell the police when you're going to meet somebody because you're going to have sex with them. So somebody found not guilty has to report this intimate information to their local police force. And of course, the female partner in this case, this is...
Well, what staggered me about it was that he has to report the name, address, and other details of the person that he may be meeting.
Yeah.
So this is an invasion of privacy.
Well, somebody says utter humiliation, but of course there's all sorts of things going in this, because now we've got the stage that we have a court which finds you not guilty. If the government and the judiciary acting for the government don't want to believe that, then you're still guilty effectively, and they're going to be tracking you. This was part of the email that came into us, and it said that it's got a bit on the purpose and scope of sexual harm prevention orders. When considering applying for an order or an interim order, the following should be borne in mind. Orders are to be made in relation to a person who has been convicted, found not guilty by reason of insanity, or found to be under a disability, and to have done the act charge or cautioned, etc.
What does etc. mean?
Well,
in this context,
that could have been put in the email, Mike. Yeah. We've got a lot more work to do on this, but this is so dangerous. And what can we follow it up with? Well, of course, if you've got the government that is simply going to say you're guilty, we don't really care whether a jury has found you not guilty, then we need to look at what the British governments have been up to. And the Telegraph here has reported over the weekend about another MI5 whistleblower who's saying that the agency knew about torture in Guantanamo Bay, and he wants to give evidence to a parliamentary inquiry. That, of course, will be secret. We'll come on to that. But in this article, we're saying that in 2014, this is the key document, the US Senate Intelligence Committee found that CIA officers had conducted a brutal regime on captives of repeated waterboarding. That itself is torture. There is no ifs or buts. Slapping, stress positions and sleep deprivation. Well, that might be considered cruel treatment, but waterboarding is torture. And let's have a look at what Guru Admiral Lord West, former head of the Royal Navy, I believe at the time that Satanism was approved, and of course he's former security minister, he said, well, there may have been the odd case, Mike, where UK agents were present when US agents were waterboarding, torturing. So what we've got is the picture growing and growing of complicity by British governments in torture. And it says that the MI5 officer is likely to confirm top-level meetings were held at MI5 HQ Thames House in 2002 to discuss torture claims. Now, we're just bang it home here that the evidence is to be heard in private, and the paper says much of it will never be made public. So this is Britain, David Cameron's Britain in 2016. You remove information from the Conservative Party website because it was your election promises, of course, a pack of lies. You get rid of those. And we're going to come on in a minute to the shutdown of freedom of information. But before we get there, just have a look at other things, of course, that people want silenced. This is Barbara Hewson, the famous QC that laughed on television at the mention of satanic ritual abuse. She thinks the whole thing is a big joke. And we thought it was interesting that it appears this document has suddenly come into the public domain. It was produced by a lady in the Maranatha Society, but it's been with the Children's Commissioner since 2012, and now suddenly it's been released, and this has come into the public domain. So we're going to say we're not quite sure what's going on here, but on one hand we've got a lady, Barbara Hewson, if I can call her that, who appears to be very influential, saying we need to, well, what she's saying, Cameron could also crack down on spurious allegations of historic sexual abuse. So this QC wants it hushed up as fast as possible. So abuse of children, we need silenced. Torture, we definitely need to keep that under the carpet. And what better man to start the process than our old friend Jack Straw?
Indeed. So Telegraph claiming this is an exclusive, and really what's underneath all this is this word independent. What does make somebody an independent contributor, or what makes an organisation an independent organisation? We absolutely believe there's no such thing as independence in the public sector at all, and this is just another example of it. So here we've got Jack Straw, who helped formulate the freedom of information legislation in the first place. He is on the panel, the 5-strong panel to review the Freedom of Information Act, and unfortunately the Telegraph has discovered that he has been taking money from some of his paying clients to advise them on how to avoid giving out emails that they may have transferred between themselves and a public body under the Freedom of Information Act. So how to avoid any kind of transparency is what he's doing for at least part of his living, and yet he's sitting on the panel to review the Freedom of Information Act. Pretty staggering.
Pretty staggering,
not surprising, perhaps.
Or not surprising. And then, of course, his son is helping out at the moment. Trust me, that's what he's saying. We need to be in Europe. Well, let's just go into this a little bit more. Couldn't resist this photograph from the Mail, because I think this picture says a lot of Blair and Straw clearly conniving here. So here's the headline: Straw advised the client on the freedom of information dodging, and as Mike's just said, it was in relation to information held by a company, a commodity trading company, ED&F Man, and he said basically you can avoid having to release the information by saying they're commercially sensitive, and yes, he's got a role. Well, let's remember that the government itself set up this so-called independent commission, as you said, Mike, and people can go online and have a look at that. War crimes or anything in the public interest, we need to keep a lid on it. We need to deceive the public. And if we delve into this a bit more, the evidence is all there in the past. So we've got the Telegraph here originally saying, well, in Libya, Gaddafi squads were torturing people in shipping containers. So Britain pointing the finger at Gaddafi, he was the torturer. And then here we are, this is the Guardian ripping into Syria. Of course, it's that nasty man Assad, he's into torture. And we better bring in Saddam Hussein, because British dossier accuses Saddam of torture. Well, what's really been going on? Well, of course, the British government itself has been using and condoning and lying about the use of torture. And let's have a look at some of the original names, because, of course, we've got young David Miliband trying to rebrand himself as a caring member of international rescue. when in fact he was in post when people were being transported for torture.
Can I just mention the article on the front page of the UK Column website at the moment, with which is specifically about international rescue? I suggest people have a look at it.
Yeah. Okay, and it's hypocrisy at best, but this is very, very dangerous if we've got a government that, of course, is making sure that there's no common law in the courts and they're covering up torture. It's pretty obvious what's going on here, isn't it? And I thought we'd just bring in this little picture, which I tweeted out some time ago. This was part of a Mail video where Tony Blair was being asked questions to do with, of course, his activity in creating wars. And as I pointed out, the look on his face was pure fear. But Tony Blair and David Cameron, Gordon Brown, Jack Straw, not the bad guys. It's Putin, I think. Mike.
Yes, and this the Litvinenko, at least they're trying to keep the Litvinenko thing going. This is another article from Edward Lucas from The Economist, published by the Telegraph yesterday, and they just are. I mean, there's no steam in this. It seems nobody is buying it, but they keep trying anyway, beating a drum that really can't. That nobody's listening to. Edward Lucas absolutely hysterical about Putin, and he's propagandizing as hard as he can. We'll just draw your attention to this article from Patrick Henningsen. 21st Century Wire, Litvinenko's brother blaming Putin for murder is ridiculous. Britain had more reason to kill him. Now, this has been published in a number of the mainstream papers as well. But this is Maxim Litvinenko, his younger brother. He lives in Italy, and he is quoted by a number of news outlets, including 21st Century Wire, saying, "My father and I are sure that the Russian authorities are not involved. It's all set up to put pressure on the Russian government. The Russians had no reason to want Alexander dead. My brother was not a spy. He was more like a policeman. He was in the FSB, but he worked against organised crime, murders, arms trafficking, stuff like that." That would be the kind of thing that Russian oligarchs were pretty much involved in, right? These are the ones that Putin threw out of the country.
Putin threw them out, and where did a lot of them come? London, and that was self-evident.
Right, so he was asked why Litvinenko's widow continues to suggest that the Kremlin was responsible, and in response he said she lives in London to survive. She has to play the game and make and take this point of view. She can't say anything else. So, you know, really pretty definitive comments from the family, and so it's only his widow that is actually saying anything different.
Yeah. But nasty Putin, nothing that Tony Blair would have got involved, or Peter Mandelson is mixing into those Russian companies. Nothing to see there, nothing to see in the child abuse, nothing to see in the loss of public money through the criminal sell-off of the infrastructure, just nothing to see. And one of the reasons there's nothing to see, of course, is that Cameron is going flat out for state control of the press. So thank you again for another viewer. This is Jenny, who contacted us and said, sorry, the print's a bit small, I'll read it out. "Are we seeing a new press regulator coming onto the scene? An organisation is calling itself Impress." I think you mentioned this a little while ago, Mike, which is seeking recognition under the Royal Charter. How many self-regulating parts of the press, as stated in the Leveson inquiry, do they want? There are some interesting people in their organisation. This is something that's gone very quiet recently, which is press regulation. This is information received from Inform blog, which was gratefully received. Well, this is what the lady's talking about, this organisation here, and we thought the only way to explain this is a UK column wiring diagram. So let's get into press and media independence. David Cameron style, that is state control. And of course the whole thing comes back to David Cameron's government and the Privy Council. And if we remember at the time, Nick Clegg was the man in the Privy Council driving this policy. So it's government policy from the outset. They set up the Royal Charter on self-regulation of the press. And within that charter, it establishes the Press Recognition Panel. And
that would be an independent panel, would it?
Spot on. We'll bring that in. Entirely independent, Mike. Independent of government, parliament, the press, or any other such interest. Independence and transparency fundamental. So we're reassured there. Shall I read that again? I think we will. It's entirely independent of government. The government's created it, but it's independent of government, parliament. Parliament created it. Still independent. It's independent of the press or any other such interest. Independence and transparency are fundamental. Now, if we can just get this to work, we will see where we go from here. And here it is. So we thought we'd have a look at some of the people involved. And this is a very interesting chap, Dr. Wolf. Why did we find him interesting? Well, because he's a big wheel QC with matrix chambers, which just happens, of course, to be connected with the Blair Empire, so totally independent of the government there. We've got this gentleman, Harry Caton, Chief Executive of the Professional Standards Authority. So we've got another government type man. He's involved with Comic Relief, the Alzheimer's Society. Quite interesting. He's been messing around with that. Or we could bring in this lady, Emma Gilpin-Jacobs. She's worked in strategic communications for over 17 years with media companies. She's been Group Corporate Affairs Director at Regis PLC, then Time Incorporated, Financial Times, and oh dear, she was Director of Communications for the Deputy Prime Minister. So no interests, totally independent, all these people. We just follow on through because it's quite good fun. Caroline Regan took up the Chief Executive of the West London Mental Health Trust, NHS West London Clinical Commissioning Group, Olympics, Board of Trustees, Just for Kids Law. Who is this lady, do you think?
Don't know.
Do you think she's independent? She seems to be on the public sector gravy train. And this one, I think, gets the biscuit. Tim Souter. Worked on Newsnight before becoming Deputy Head Managing Executive Director for BBC Television. All totally independent.
Yep.
It's quite brilliant, isn't it? Right, so let's see whether we can go back to the diagram, see what was happening. Well, let's bring in this man, Sir David Normington, ex-permanent Secretary for the Home Office. He was brought in as the Commissioner for Public Appointments. Independent, of course, independently appointed by the government. And what did he do? Well, he was there to get the Independent Appointments Committee going. And what sort of people came in? Well, we got Dame Anne Pringle, Public Appointments Assessor. So she's totally independent of the government because she's Public Appointments Assessor. We've got Dr. Chitra Baruka, former Vice Chair of the BBC Trust and General Medical Council. Andrew Flanagan, the Chief Executive of Scottish Media Group, but he's currently a Civil Service Commissioner, so he's independent of government. Elizabeth France, former Information Commissioner, and she's the current Chair of the Office for Legal Complaints, so she's independent. It's encouraging, Mike, isn't it, the quality of the independence. So the Independent Appointments Committee appoints the chair and board of the press recognition panel, and it's all independent. And then along comes InPress, and it says, we are the people you need to appoint to put us in charge of regulating the press. So it sells itself, and they're waiting for the press recognition panel to give them the job because apparently there's no other bids. Where did they come from? Well, they were created by Jonathan Haywood, Fabian, ex-English Pen. What was that organisation, Mike? It's some sort of writers' guild almost, I think.
Well, it's supposed to be campaigning for freedom of speech.
Ah, okay.
So it's campaigning for freedom of speech, and he is a lifelong freedom of speech campaigner. So he is working to set up the press regulator, which will restrict freedom of speech.
Right, okay. And of course, we remember that he was involved with the Sigrid Rousing Trust, which is a very, very interesting organisation linked to UNESCO media and internet policy.
And they invest in all kinds. So he was a director of that for a year before he joined or before he set up InPress. and they invest in philanthropic organisation like them all. They invest in all kinds of things, including, interestingly enough, since 2008 they were investing in English Pen, and they have also pumped money into, not very much I'll acknowledge, but nonetheless they have also pumped money into the Open Society foundations.
Well, interesting you should mention Open Society, because that brings us to George Soros, but not quite at the moment. Let's just put this link in here. So Impress is self-created. It appears out of nowhere due to the efforts of Jonathan Haywood. And if we have a look in the background of what's been going on with his career, we've got links through to serious change investment management. They were offering $100 million of helping the world, which is always good. And then here we are, we also found links through to a little bit of money, but nevertheless donated to George Soros's Open Society in Greece. So there we have it, David Cameron working rapidly to get Impress in control of the press and media. Anybody who writes anything exposing what the government's doing would have to answer to them, but we can all relax, because of course they're totally independent.
So George Osborne was in Liverpool this morning meeting Bill Gates, because they are going to spend £3 billion. They are now committed to sorting out malaria, and I have no doubt, as they don't actually say it, but I have no doubt that this effectively is going to be a £3 billion vaccination programme. That is what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are particularly into. So they were speaking at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and Justine Greening was there as well, and they were revealing this significant funding, as they call it, £3 billion. Chancellor said, "I'm determined that our overseas aid budget is spent on the challenges people in Britain want to see addressed, and those that threaten global and national security." I'm not quite sure how malaria threatens national security, but there you go. So what more is there to say?
Can I just say, Mike, before you take it off the screen, pretty unpleasant picture, that when you look at it, who created that picture?
Yeah, it's a work of art.
It's a work of art, yeah, particularly with the young man holding his crutch there. So I'm not quite sure what this is about, but I don't get good vibes off it.
Yeah. So anyway, we'll see where that goes, but I think it goes for bad times for certain parts of the world. But anyway, economy. This is a blog post from the United States. I do apologise. I've got these in. Have I got these in the wrong order? I do indeed. It doesn't matter. So this is really discussing derivatives contracts, and particularly Morgan Stanley. This is by Pam and Russ Martins, and they're pointing out the exposure that Morgan Stanley has to derivatives contracts. Because in the case of Morgan Stanley, unlike other banks, for example, Citibank or JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or these types of banks, Morgan Stanley, its exposure is mainly as a result of investment from individuals and small investors. So what these people are saying is, unlike other banks holding the lion's share of derivatives, Morgan Stanley is far more involved in retail brokerage accounts and has 15,771 retail brokers as of July 2015. So that's 15,771 people selling complex derivatives products to individuals, and those individuals are what are being described in the article as mom and pop clients, who are basically going to lose all their money in the not too distant future. Of course, we all believe, or we're all told, that our deposits in the bank are insured, and this is a speech at the Peterson Institute for International Economics by Thomas Hoenig, who's the head of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which of course insures deposits in the United States. And this is basically what he's saying here. This is the latest rule which has been proposed by the Federal Reserve, which mandates banks to raise $550 billion in loss-absorbing capital, and this is these so-called bail-in bonds. Now, this is part of the bail-in strategy, and it's one of the reasons why the bonds market froze up in early January, because of course nobody wanted to buy any of these bail-in bonds. If you know that the investment that you're making is the first investment to go if the bank should fail, are you going to make an investment in that financial instrument? Would you do that, Brian?
I don't think I would.
No. So what Thomas Hoenig said was mandating increased levels of debt as part of a broad prescribed resolution strategy has potential effects that paradoxically may undermine the very financial stability being sought. So in other words, he's saying it's nuts. The proposal would force banks to issue hundreds of billions of dollars in new debt and encourage them to acquire riskier, higher yielding assets or expand into non-banking activities to cover costs. The proposal offers no assurance that the amount of debt required would be sufficient to avoid failure or panic. So, well, what can you say?
Bradbury Pound and Glass-Steagall, presumably.
Indeed. I just had to comment on this because this is more Western commentators still trying to convince themselves that China is not a threat. In this case, it's the Council on Foreign Relations Foreign Affairs magazine, and they have been China has been on the rise according to the article, but don't worry because it won't last, and so on. This again, another effort by them to convince themselves that China is not a threat to the financial system, but of course, all the while that they're complaining about problems with the Chinese stock market. China just investing in real physical infrastructure in just about every so-called emerging economy that there is, and basically the Western economies are going to be left holding what? Nothing, thin air, because the money was created out of thin air. It's still only worth thin air, and China's going to end up with everything else, really.
Yeah. Well, how is it that our MPs seem totally divorced from common sense these days? Somebody said, is this a little bit of a clue? It's only taken from Twitter, but this is Lucy Allen MP, who was having a bit of a whinge about BBC Shropshire. Why did you claim I wanted to veto questions? And then she says, Sun Politics. Evidence shows this is untrue. What are you trying to do? And one of our viewers said that the comment here was pretty interesting. Nice to see you referring to yourself in the first person for a change. It was probably bad, Lucy, who wanted to veto the questions. And so the person said, are we starting to see actually MPs that are not just divorced from reality, they're actually living in a different world? And one of the things we would like to really push in the coming weeks is the Behavioural Insights team, the government's attempt to use applied behavioural psychology to change the way we think, what our values are, what our morality is, because the evidence seems to be pointing that this is going to be used very strongly to skew the referendum. So if you're not aware of the use of NLP by the British government, the so-called nudge policy, it's time you started to have a look into that, because unless stopped, it's going to be used to try and skew the vote for yes, we want to stay in Europe. And if there are any UKIP supporters out there who can explain to the UK column why it is that Nigel Farrarge seems so shy of talking about real issues to do with Britain, we'd like to hear from you.
Just before we go, a couple of important comments. First of all, no Ian Crinn tonight. He is elsewhere this week. Fracking Nightmare and Crinn Report will be back next Monday. And I just want to mention that I'm going to be joined by a very special guest tomorrow on UK Column News. I'm not going to say who that is just at the moment, but please join us tomorrow for a very, very interesting discussion.
Okay, well, that's the end of our news today. Just to say that, of course, the European referendum is by no means the end, because the whole process is illegal, unlawful. In fact, it's the correct expression. So it's not over till the last man is down, and a lot of work to be done to expose what this criminal government of David Cameron is actually up to. And just remember the torture subject we've covered today. Ask a few of your friends, colleagues, what they think of it. You might also like to contact your local Conservative associations to demand answers from them about David Cameron's condoning of torture. Thanks very much for joining us. As Mike said, we'll be back tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Thank you. Bye-bye.